My name is Connie Kingston, and I am 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I've poured every ounce of my soul and every dollar I could scrape together into my small flower shop, a little haven of life and color I called the Briar Patch. It was my escape from the creeping decay of my actual home, a world that always smelled faintly of whiskey and regret. I never imagined that the single worst night of my life, the night I was reduced to a chip on a poker table, would become the catalyst for my own salvation. And I certainly never believed that the man who won me, Damian Blackwood, a man whose name was a synonym for corporate ruthlessness in our city, was anything other than the monster everyone claimed he was. He was a shark, a predator, and he had just claimed me as his prize. But the truth, as I would learn through terror and confusion, was far more complicated than that. The cage he built for me was the first safe place I had ever known. Before I dive into the night that tore my world apart, only to rebuild it into something unrecognizable, I want to connect with all of you listening. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt trapped by your circumstances, like a pawn in someone else's game, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for anyone new here, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is a community for people who understand that sometimes the deepest betrayals come from the people who are supposed to protect us. Living with my father, Clement, was like living with a ghost who had an insatiable hunger. The man who had taught me how to ride a bike and who once read me bedtime stories had long since been consumed by his addiction. In his place was a specter haunted by numbers, by cards, by the phantom thrill of a win that was always just one more hand away. Our small apartment was his tomb, cluttered with racing forms and empty bottles. The air was thick with the ghosts of his failures. Every ring of the phone sent a spike of anxiety through my chest. Every knock at the door made me flinch, expecting a man with a broken nose and no patience. I worked tirelessly at the shop, not just for my dream, but to pay for his life, to keep the lights on, to buy the groceries he'd forget about. Love had curdled into a heavy, weary sense of obligation. I loved the memory of my father, but I was chained to the reality of Clement. The night of the game, he told me he was going to a business meeting, a high-stakes poker night, with some investors who could, he promised with a desperate gleam in his eye, change our lives forever. He was right about that, at least. It changed everything. I wasn't there, of course. My presence would have been an inconvenience, a reminder of the real world he was so desperate to gamble away. I pieced together the events of that night later, from the shame-faced confessions of my father and the cold, clipped reports I eventually found. The game took place in the penthouse suite of the Olympian Hotel, a place of hushed carpets and dark wood, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive liquor. The men at the table were sharks, all of them. Men my father, in his cheap, slightly too tight suit, had no business being in a room with. What he didn't know was that the entire ecosystem had been designed for a single purpose. The players, the dealer, the very cards they used, all had been curated. At the head of the table, silent and observant, sat Damian Blackwood. He was a legend in the city, a man who had built an empire from nothing before he was 30. His face was all sharp angles and chilling stillness, his eyes missing any discernible warmth. He rarely played, but when he did, the stakes were astronomical. My father, buoyed by an initial, calculated streak of wins that were allowed to him, grew bold. He was high on the delusion of control, the gambler's fallacy whispering sweet lies in his ear. He started betting recklessly, the pile of chips in front of him dwindling with each turn of a card. I can picture him sweating, his collar suddenly too tight, the jovial mask slipping to reveal the raw panic underneath. The other players, all part of the charade, began to fold, to pull back, leaving him isolated, leaving him one-on-one with the apex predator. The final pot was huge, a sum that could have erased all his debts and set him up for life. He had a good hand, a great hand even, but Damien had a better one. Clement pushed all his remaining chips into the center of the table. Damien matched him without blinking, his expression as serene as a frozen lake. The cards were turned. Damien won. My father was wiped out, utterly ruined. There was a silence in the room, heavy and complete. Clement was pale, his breathing ragged. This was the moment the trap was supposed to spring. But instead of calling in the debt, a debt he knew my father could never pay, Damien leaned back in his chair. His voice, when he spoke, was low and devoid of emotion. "You have another asset, Clement." My father, confused and broken, shook his head. "I have nothing. You have it all." Damien let the silence stretch, a cruel, deliberate pause. "You have a daughter, Connie." He said my name. A man I had never met, a corporate phantom from the business pages, said my name in that room full of smoke and ruin. "I've seen the pictures in your wallet. Lovely girl. Runs a flower shop." My father stared at him, horrified. The other men at the table, Damien's puppets, murmured. One of them, a man named Petrov, chuckled darkly. An old-world wager, a man's daughter. The seed of the idea, so monstrous, so medieval, was planted. My father, in his addict's mind, saw a lifeline. He saw a way out, a chance to win it all back. The sickness had eaten away at his soul so completely that he looked at his own child and saw collateral. "What are you proposing?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Damien named the terms. "Her hand in marriage, that will be your stake. Your debt will be cleared, and you'll get one more hand, double or nothing. Winner takes all." It was a grotesque proposition, a devil's bargain, offered in a haze of smoke. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me from the monsters of the world, looked across the table at the biggest monster of them all, and he agreed. He put me on the table. For one last hand, the dealer dealt the cards. My father's hands trembled as he picked them up. Whatever hope he had died in his eyes, he had nothing. Damien didn't even need to show his cards. He simply watched my father's face crumble. "I believe that's my win," Damien said, his voice as quiet and final as a closing vault. He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at my father, a broken man, weeping silently into his hands. "I will be in touch to arrange the details of my engagement," he told me the next morning. I was trimming thorns from a shipment of white roses, my fingers deft and practiced, when he stumbled into the shop. He looked like he hadn't slept, his face ashen, his eyes red-rimmed and evasive. He reeked of stale fear. He tried to soften it, to frame it as some kind of strategic move, a temporary arrangement that would solve all our problems. "He's a very powerful man, Connie. He can help us. This is just a formality." The words didn't make sense. They were just noise, static in the air, until the core of it finally penetrated my shock. "You did what?" I asked, the shears still in my hand. He repeated it, his voice cracking, trying to sell the lie to me and to himself. "I wagered your hand, an engagement, and I lost." The shears fell from my hand and clattered to the floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the small, quiet shop. I stared at him, seeing him, for the first time, not as my father, not as a sick man I had to care for, but as a stranger, a man who had sold me. The shock gave way to a wave of cold, sharp fury, unlike anything I had ever felt. "You bet me?" My voice was low, trembling with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. "Like a horse? Like a stack of chips?" He flinched, taking a step back. "Connie, please, you have to understand." But I didn't want to understand. I wanted to hurt him. "No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to ask for understanding. There is nothing to understand. You took your daughter, your only child, and you threw her away on a card game because you are too weak, too pathetic to face what you've done." I was screaming now, years of swallowed resentment, of fear and frustration, and weary disappointment, erupting from me. The sound echoed off the glass walls of my little shop, shattering the peace I had so carefully cultivated. He just stood there, absorbing it, his face a mask of pathetic self-pity. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was the most insulting thing he could have said. Sorry didn't fix this. Sorry didn't unsell his daughter. The bell on the shop door chimed the next day. I looked up, expecting a customer, my heart still a cold, hard knot in my chest. It was Damian Blackwood. He was taller than I'd expected, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that probably cost more than my shop's entire inventory. His presence seemed to suck all the air and color out of the room. My vibrant flowers seemed to shrink away from him. He closed the door behind him, the small chime sounding like a death knell. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any pleasantries. His eyes, a shade of deep, stormy gray, swept over the shop once, then landed on me. They weren't leering or triumphant. They were assessing. It was somehow worse. "Connie Kingston," he said. It wasn't a question. "You will pack a bag, just the essentials. You will be staying with me from now on." My fury from the day before reignited. "I will be doing no such thing. You need to leave my shop." Now I stood my ground, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his features before being suppressed. "Your father entered into an agreement," he stated calmly, as if discussing a corporate merger. "That agreement is between you and a gambling addict who has no legal right to my life," I retorted, my voice shaking slightly. "That agreement is not with me. I don't know who you think you are, but you have no power here." He took a single step forward, and I instinctively took one back. "Power," he said, his voice dropping lower, "is about controlling the options. Let us review your options. Option 1, you come with me. We announce our engagement. You live in my home. Your father's considerable debts to some very unpleasant individuals are erased. This shop," he gestured around him, "is protected." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Option 2, you refuse. I collect on your father's debt to me personally, which is the least of his worries. I have also, this morning, acquired the outstanding markers he has with Mr. Petroff and his associates. They are not as patient as I am. They will take their payment from your father's body, and when that is not enough, they will take it from his assets, specifically, this shop. You will lose everything, and your father will go to prison, if he's lucky. It was a perfect, brutal checkmate. He had anticipated my every move, my every point of leverage, and systematically destroyed it. He had boxed me in so completely that there was no way out. The rage drained out of me, replaced by a hollow, sickening despair. He wasn't a suitor, he was a warden, and he had just shown me the walls of my prison. Tears of frustration and helplessness burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let him see them. I lifted my chin, the last act of defiance I had left. "Fine," I whispered, the word tasting like poison. "Fine." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My driver is waiting outside. You have 1 hour." He turned and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of my life, the scent of roses suddenly smelling like funeral wreaths. The penthouse was on the 90th floor of the Blackwood Tower, a sleek, sterile needle of glass and steel that pierced the sky. From up there, the city was a silent, glittering map. It felt like living on the moon. The apartment was vast, a monument to minimalist wealth. White marble floors, black leather furniture, and enormous floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the city like a piece of art. There was no clutter, no personal touches, no warmth. It was beautiful, but it was as soulless as a mausoleum. A woman in a crisp gray uniform introduced herself as Mrs. Gable. She had kind eyes but a formal, distant demeanor. She showed me to my room, a suite, really larger than my entire apartment, and informed me that Mr. Blackwood had instructed that I was to have anything I needed. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. I was a guest, a possession to be maintained. For the first few days, I was a ghost haunting the gilded cage. Damien was rarely there. He left before I woke up and returned long after I had retreated to my room. Our only communication was through Mrs. Gable, or the occasional note left on the marble island in the kitchen, written in a sharp, decisive script. "There is an account for you at Bergdorf's. A car is available for your use. Dinner tonight is at 8. We have a reservation." They were instructions, not invitations. I rebelled in the only ways I could. I refused to go shopping. I didn't use the car. I ate the simple meals I asked Mrs. Gable to prepare for me in my room. ignoring the gourmet food prepared by his private chef. My defiance was a silent, petty war, and he seemed utterly indifferent to it, which only stoked my frustration. I felt invisible, an object placed on a shelf and then forgotten. After a week of this silent treatment, I woke up to find a small, black velvet box on my nightstand. Inside was not jewelry, but a single, exquisitely crafted silver key. Beside it was a note. The locks on your shop have been upgraded. This is your new key. I stared at it. He was a step ahead of me, always. He knew the one place I would want to go, the one part of my life I would cling to. Later that morning, another envelope appeared. Inside was a bank statement for a new business account in the name of the Briar Patch. It had a balance of $50,000. The memo line read, "Inventory and operating expenses." It wasn't a gift, it was a leash. He was not just my captor, he was now my silent business partner, my benefactor. He was weaving his control into every corner of my life, even the one place I thought was mine. I hated him for it, but as I clutched the key in my hand, a sick, shameful wave of relief washed over me. My shop was safe, and that single fact was a crack in the perfect, solid wall of my hatred for Damian Blackwood. I went to my shop the next day, the silver key feeling cold and foreign in my hand. The new lock was a heavy, formidable piece of steel. It opened smoothly, and as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of damp earth and green stems was like a balm to my soul. But everything was subtly different. The leaky faucet on the prep sink had been replaced. A new state-of-the-art temperature control system was humming quietly on the wall, something I had dreamed of but could never afford. The rent, I discovered from a notice on my desk, had been paid in full for the next 2 years. His control was absolute, silent, and suffocatingly thorough. I spent the day working, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of conditioning flowers, creating arrangements, feeling the dirt under my fingernails. It was the first time I had felt like myself since he had walked into my life. That evening, a notorious loan shark named Frankie Gallo, a man whose sneer had haunted my nightmares, swaggered into the shop just before closing. He was one of my father's most persistent creditors. "Well, well," he said, looking around. "Heard you came into some money. Clement's debt is past due." My blood ran cold. I opened my mouth to tell him I had nothing, but before I could speak, 2 men in dark suits stepped out of a black town car that had pulled up silently to the curb. They didn't look at me. They walked into the shop and stood on either side of Frankie. The bigger of the two leaned down and whispered something in his ear. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the color drain from Frankie's face. He looked from the man to me, and then back again, a new, respectful fear in his eyes. He nodded curtly, turned, and practically ran out of the shop. The 2 men gave me a brief, impersonal nod and then returned to their car and drove away. I stood there, trembling. Damien hadn't just given me money. He had put a wall of his power around me, a shadow army to keep the wolves at bay. I felt protected and violated all at once. A few weeks later, he informed me, via another note, that we would be attending the annual Hospital Foundation Gala. "It is expected," the note read. "You will require a dress." I had no intention of being paraded around like a prize. I told Mrs. Gable I wasn't going. An hour later, a team from a high-end boutique arrived at the penthouse, wheeling in racks of designer gowns. Damien appeared in the doorway of my room, as I stood there stubbornly in my jeans and t-shirt, surrounded by a sea of silk and sequins. It was the first time we'd been in the same room for more than a minute in weeks. "You will choose a dress, Connie," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, "or I will choose one for you." He wasn't asking. I knew it was a battle I couldn't win. I chose the simplest dress I could find, a deep emerald green silk that felt like armor. The gala was a glittering nightmare. I was acutely aware of the whispers that followed us, the curious and speculative glances. I was Damian Blackwood's mysterious new fiancé. I stood by his side, a silent, beautiful prop, sipping champagne and nodding, while he conducted business with a smile that never reached his cold gray eyes. A rival of his, a man named Marcus Thorne, cornered me while Damien was speaking with the hospital chairman. "You're a brave woman," Thorne said with a slick, condescending smile, "taming the Blackwood beast. Be careful, he devours everything he touches. He gutted my company last year, left hundreds of people jobless, and didn't lose a wink of sleep over it." His words reinforced every fear I had. He was a monster, and I was in his lair. Later in the evening, as I was trying to find a quiet corner to catch my breath, a portly, red-faced man, who'd had far too much to drink, cornered me by the terrace doors. He put his hand on my lower back, his fingers pressing unpleasantly into my skin. "So you're the one who finally landed the big fish." He slurred, his breath hot and sour. "Must have something special to warm up that block of ice." I tried to pull away, my skin crawling. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight. He only tightened his grip. "Don't be shy, sweetheart." Suddenly, a cold presence was beside us. Damien. I hadn't even seen him approach. He didn't say a word, he just looked at the man. He fixed his cold gray eyes on him, and the man's drunken bravado evaporated. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. "My apologies, Blackwood," he stammered, before making a hasty retreat. Damien turned to me. "Are you all right?" he asked. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were dark, intense. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little shaky. He placed a hand lightly on my arm to guide me back to our table. The gesture was brief, impersonal, but for a split second it felt protective. On the silent drive home, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The ruthless man who gutted companies had just shielded me with an intensity that felt deeply personal. The contradictions of him were beginning to give me vertigo. My curiosity, piqued by the gala incident, turned into a quiet investigation. I began exploring the vast, silent penthouse during the long days I spent alone. I avoided the entertainment rooms and the gym, drawn instead to a heavy oak door at the end of a long hallway. It was his private study, a place Mrs. Gable had told me was strictly off-limits. One afternoon, driven by a restless need to understand the man who controlled my life, I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room was the heart of his empire. One wall was covered in monitors, displaying stock tickers and global news feeds. Another was lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling. But it wasn't a library for show. These books were worn, read, and as I scanned the titles, my breath caught in my throat. There were entire sections on horticulture, on botany, on the history of floral design. There were first editions of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Emily Dickinson. It was my own personal library, curated by a stranger. My hand trembled as I pulled out a volume of Dickinson's poems. As I opened it, a small pressed flower fell into my palm. It was a white camellia, perfectly preserved. A memory, distant and hazy, surfaced. 5 years ago, I was just starting out, working a part-time job for a big event florist. We were doing the arrangements for this very hospital gala. I remember being so proud of the centerpieces, especially the ones with the delicate white camellias. As I worked, I'd felt a pair of eyes on me. I'd glanced up and seen a young man standing in the shadows at the edge of the ballroom, watching me with a strange, quiet intensity. He wasn't in a tuxedo like the other guests who were starting to arrive. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, looking out of place. Our eyes met for just a second before I looked away, flustered. I had forgotten about him completely, until now. I sank into the leather chair behind his massive desk, the pressed flower in my hand. Could that quiet, intense observer have been a young Damien Blackwood, before he became the titan everyone feared? The idea was so preposterous, so utterly insane, that it had to be impossible. But the books, the flower, the evidence was there. He knew me, he had known me for years. The next time I saw him, I confronted him. I found him in the dining room, staring out at the city lights. I held up the book. "Why this? Why all of them?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I expected. "Why is your library filled with my favorite things?" He turned slowly, his expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. My assistant is very thorough in her research. It is important to know one's business associate. The lie was so blatant, so dismissive, it was like a slap in the face. Your assistant didn't put a 5-year-old flower in this book. I shot back, my heart hammering. I remember that night. At the gala, you were there, you were watching me. For the first time, I saw a genuine crack in his composure. A flicker of something, vulnerability, maybe even pain, crossed his face before it was gone, replaced by the familiar coldness. You are mistaken, he said flatly, and turned back to the window, ending the conversation. But I had seen it. He was hiding something. The man who had taken my life wasn't a stranger. He was a spectator, a ghost who had been in the wings of my life all along. The final piece of the puzzle arrived via a phone call a week later. The number was unfamiliar. Am I speaking with Connie Kingston? A kind, professional voice asked. My name is Dr. Anya Sharma. I'm the director of the Northwood Recovery Center. I'm calling about your father, Clement Kingston. My stomach dropped. My father? What's happened? He's fine, Miss Kingston. In fact, he's more than fine. He checked himself into our facility 2 weeks ago. He's just completed his detoxification and is beginning our 90-day intensive program. I was stunned into silence. My father, who had resisted every attempt I'd ever made to get him help, had checked himself into rehab. How? I finally managed to ask. Who's paying for this? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Well, that's the thing. An anonymous benefactor has covered all the costs, and I must say, in my 20 years of practice, I have never seen such a comprehensive plan. They've arranged for not only his treatment here, but also for post-treatment sober living, vocational training, and debt counseling. Whoever this person is, they aren't just trying to dry him out, they're trying to give him his life back. My hand holding the phone was shaking. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. There was only one person with the resources and the motive to do something so thorough, so controlling, so complete. He wasn't just caging me, he was methodically, ruthlessly, cleaning up every single broken piece of the life my father had shattered, and I had no idea why. A month into his treatment, my father was allowed a supervised visit. Damien arranged it. He had Clement brought to the penthouse, which felt like a deliberate power play, forcing my father to see the world his daughter now inhabited. A sober Clement was a stranger to me. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame that seemed to weigh down his entire body. He sat on the edge of one of the expensive leather sofas, looking small and out of place. He tried to apologize, the words catching in his throat, his eyes welling with tears. It was a halting, rambling confession of his failures, as a man and as a father. I listened, my heart a hard, protected knot. I had heard apologies before, but then in his desperate attempt to explain the night of the card game, he let something slip. I was so stupid, Connie, so blind, after I made that horrible bet. Damien's man, the one who drove me to the clinic, he told me this was the only way. I froze. What man? What did he tell you? Clement looked confused, as if he'd said too much. He just said that Mr. Blackwood had been watching out for you for a long time. Ever since that hospital thing you did with the flowers years ago. He said those sharks, the men I owed money to, they weren't just going to take the shop, they were going to take you. He said Mr. Blackwood couldn't let that happen. He said the game was the only way to get you out. The world tilted on its axis. Every confusing piece, every contradiction, every unsettling act of kindness, every cold, calculated move snapped into place. The library, the paid rent, the men who scared off Frankie Gallo, his presence at the gala 5 years ago. It wasn't a random acquisition, it was an extraction, a rescue mission disguised as a hostile takeover of my life. I left my father sitting there and stormed through the penthouse, my mind reeling. I found Damien in his study, the one I had snuck into weeks before. He was standing by the window, his back to me. You planned it, I said, my voice shaking with a cocktail of fury and disbelief. All of it. The card game. You invited those men, you let my father win, and then you bled him dry. all so you could make him desperate enough to put me on the table. He turned around slowly. The mask was gone. His face was stark, his gray eyes turbulent with emotions he had kept locked away for so long. He didn't deny it. Yes, the single word was a confession and a confirmation that sent my world spinning. Why? I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. Why would you do something so cruel, so manipulative? You didn't win me, you bought me, you terrified me, you let me believe you were a monster, because you would have never accepted my help otherwise, he said, his voice raw, ragged with a sincerity that stunned me. I've been watching you for 5 years, Connie, since I saw you in that ballroom creating something so beautiful and alive, completely unaware of the darkness surrounding you. I started to keep track of you, from a distance. I saw your talent, your struggle, and I saw your father's addiction worsening. I saw the men he was getting involved with. He walked over to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a thick file and laid it in front of me. These are from the private investigator I hired 6 months ago. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, pictures of Frankie Gallo and his men parked outside my shop late at night, transcripts of conversations where they talked about my father's debt, about how they would take the shop and then make the daughter work it off. There was a detailed plan they had to threaten me, to intimidate me into signing over the deed. The final report outlined their backup plan. If I refused, they would arrange an accident, a fire at the shop to collect the insurance money after bankrupting me. I felt sick. These were threats I had never even known existed, dangers that had been circling me like sharks. Your father was going to lose everything, Connie, Damien continued, his voice softer now. He would have dragged you down with him. They would have destroyed you. I tried to find other ways. I anonymously offered to buy his debt. He refused, too proud. I tried to invest in your shop through a third party. He controlled the finances and gambled the money away. He was a sinking ship, and he was determined to drown you with him. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. The card game was a crude, desperate solution. It was ugly, it was ruthless, but it was the only way I could sever you from him completely, get you under my protection, and give you the security you needed to be free. It was the only way to save you that you couldn't refuse. He then pushed a sleek leather folder across the desk towards me. I opened it. Inside was a legally notarized document, completely nullifying the engagement agreement, and behind it were the deeds. The deed to my shop, the deed to the small apartment building my father had lived in, all of it, signed over to my name, free and clear. You are free, Connie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You have been, from the moment you walked through my door. I just needed to make sure the threats were gone before I could tell you. I needed you to be safe. He turned and walked out of the study, leaving me alone with the shocking, terrifying, undeniable truth. My cage had been a sanctuary. My monster had been my guardian angel. Damien was true to his word. He was gone. When I emerged from the study hours later, my mind a chaotic storm of emotions, Mrs. Gable informed me that Mr. Blackwood had checked into a hotel indefinitely. He had left me the penthouse, the car, the entire infrastructure of his life, and simply removed himself from it. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It was heavier, more profound, than when he had been silently occupying the space with me. For days I wandered the vast, empty rooms, feeling like the last person on earth. The view of the city from the 90th floor no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a watchtower he had built for me. I was safe, but I was utterly alone with the whiplash of the truth. One evening, Mrs. Gable found me sitting in the dark, just staring out at the city lights. She brought me a cup of tea, her movements quiet and unobtrusive as always. He is not a simple man, Miss Kingston, she said softly, breaking her professional silence for the first time. I looked up at her, my eyes asking the question I couldn't voice. I have worked for him for 10 years, she continued, her gaze distant. He was an orphan, grew up in the system. He had no one. He learned from a very young age that the only way to be safe was to be in control of everything. His money, his business, his environment. He doesn't know how to help someone without controlling the outcome. He sees a problem, and he builds a fortress to solve it. It is not always gentle, but his intentions are fiercely protective of the very few people he chooses to care about. Her words added another layer of complexity to the man I thought I knew. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a lonely boy who had learned to build walls to survive, and he had just built the biggest wall of all around me. A few days later, I gathered my courage and did something I had been dreading. I went to the rehab facility to see my father. It was a different visit this time. I wasn't the frightened, resentful daughter anymore. I was a woman who now understood the full scope of the danger he had put me in. We sat in a small, sterile visiting room. He looked healthier, clearer. He apologized again, but this time, I stopped him. "I know about the men you owed money to, Dad," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I know what they were planning to do. I also know that Damien gave you a choice. He gave you a way out for yourself, and you chose to bet me instead." The truth hung between us, ugly and undeniable. Tears streamed down his face. "I know," he whispered. "I was sick, Connie. That sickness made me a monster." I took a deep breath. "I will support your recovery. I will come and visit you, but you and our old relationship is over. I am not your safety net anymore. I am not responsible for you. You have to save yourself. From now on, you and I will build something new, or we will have nothing at all." I was setting a boundary for the first time in my life. It was painful and terrifying, but it was also the most liberating thing I had ever done. After that visit, I needed to breathe my own air. I walked out of the penthouse, half expecting an invisible barrier to stop me, but nothing did. The doorman smiled and hailed a cab for me. I was free. I had been all along. I had the cab drop me several blocks from my shop, and I walked. I walked through the city streets, a face in the crowd. I was anonymous. I was no one's responsibility, no one's prize, no one's problem to solve. I was just me. The feeling was so new, so unfamiliar, it was dizzying. I stood across the street from the Briar Patch, looking at its cheerful green awning and bright window boxes. It was mine, truly mine, not because he had given it to me, but because I was the one who had poured my life into it. He had provided the foundation, the security, but I was the one who made it bloom. In that moment, looking at my little shop, I finally understood. He hadn't just saved me from danger. He had given me the one thing my father's chaos had never allowed me, a stable place from which to grow. He had given me a chance to be myself, free from fear, and I realized I needed to see him, not out of obligation or gratitude, but as an equal, to finally have a conversation that wasn't built on secrets and lies. I called him. He answered on the first ring. "Connie." His voice was tight, guarded. "I'd like to see you," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "I want to talk." There was a pause. "I am at your disposal. Not in the penthouse," I said quickly. "Not in your world, in mine. Meet me at my shop. In an hour." I hung up before he could reply. I needed to do this on my own turf, surrounded by my own life, my own strength. He arrived exactly 1 hour later. He was wearing simple dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. No suit, no tie. He looked younger, more uncertain than I had ever seen him. He stepped into the shop, his large frame seeming to crowd the small space. He looked around at the buckets of flowers, the half-finished arrangements, the organized chaos of my work. He looked completely out of his element. "Thank you for coming," I began. I took a deep breath and laid out the truth. "I want to thank you. You saved my shop, you saved my father, and you saved me from a danger I never knew existed. You gave me a gift I can never repay." He started to speak, but I held up a hand. "But I also need you to understand what it felt like. You treated me like a problem to be solved, a piece on a chessboard. You terrified me, Damien. You took away my agency and made me feel like a possession. Your methods, no matter how well-intentioned, were cruel." I let the words settle between us. I needed him to hear it, to understand the other side of his grand, protective gesture. He looked down at his hands, then back at me, and his eyes were filled with a deep, profound regret. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. I don't know any other way. In my world, you eliminate threats. You secure assets. I saw you as the most valuable person I had ever known, and I used the only tools I had to protect you. I am sorry, Connie, for the fear I caused you. It was never my intent. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I walked over to a bucket of yellow roses, the symbol of friendship and new beginnings. I picked one up and began to strip the thorns. That engagement, I said, not looking at him, was a contract. It was a lie, and it's over. I could feel his stillness, his silent acceptance. Then I turned to him, holding out the thornless rose. But I'm interested in getting to know the man who would orchestrate such a magnificent, insane, terrifying plan for a woman he'd only ever watched from afar. And I'd like for you to meet the woman you saved. No contracts, no debts, no secrets. I looked him straight in the eye. Would you like to get a cup of coffee with me, Damien? A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire demeanor. It reached his stormy gray eyes, and for the first time, they were filled with nothing but warmth. I would like that very much, Connie, he said. And so we began. We had coffee, and then dinner. We walked through parks and visited museums. I showed him my world of color and life. He cautiously showed me his, the world of logic and structure. I learned about the lonely boy, and he learned about the resilient woman. We built something new, something real, piece by piece, on a foundation of the strangest, most dramatic beginning I could ever have imagined. My father completed his program, and we are slowly, carefully, building a new relationship, one based on honesty and firm boundaries. He is fighting his demons, and for the first time, I believe he can win. Looking back, I see the profound irony of my life. My father, who was supposed to love and protect me, sold me into danger, and Damien, the man I believed to be a monster, a captor, went to extraordinary lengths to pull me into safety. He built me a gilded cage, yes, but he also left the door unlocked, waiting for me to find the strength to walk out on my own. He knew I had to save myself. He just made sure the world was safe for me to do it in. What I learned is that love and protection can come in the most unexpected and confusing forms, and that the facades people show the world often hide a much deeper, more complex truth. My story is a strange one, I know. I'd love to hear from you all in the comments. Have you ever completely misjudged someone, for better or for worse? Share your story below, because our experiences are what connect us. And please, don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unlikely of places. Thank you so much for listening to me, for giving my story your time and attention. Remember that your worth is not determined by the people who fail you, but by the resilience you find within yourself. I wish you all strength on your own journeys.